So again, folks who've just joined us, I want to welcome you to the American Society of Adaptation Professionals Projects and Evaluation Affinity Group June meeting. We have a really special opportunity today to be hearing from David Behar from the from the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission, and he'll be talking with us about the work that was featured to the 2017 ASAP Prize for Progress. My name is Beth Gibbons. I'm the Managing Director of ASAP, and I'm just going to give us a little bit of directionals for the next hour. So folks know we are going to be recording this webinar, so just be aware of that, and following the presentation, this information will be available on the ASAP website for you to come back and reference in the future. As we go through the presentation today, I encourage you, if you look into your GoToWebinar dialog box along what is probably the right-hand side of your screen, you should see towards the bottom a chat function. I left a message there earlier for all of you, welcoming you to the meeting, and we'd like to encourage you to use that chat box throughout the course of the presentation today to be asking questions of our Affinity co-chairs, of David as the presenter, and to be engaging in the Q&A session. We really encourage you to put those questions forward as the presentations and discussion goes along so that we can have a real-time Q&A as well as having an opportunity for questions and answers towards the end of the hour. Before we hand it off to David, I am going to first give the presentation control over to, or actually give the presenting over to Emily Wasley. Emily is with a Cadmus group, and she is one of the co-chairs of the Projects and Evaluation Affinity Group, and she's going to tell us just a little bit more about the group, the purpose, some of the goals and outcomes that we have for this group over the next year, and then we're going to be handing it over to David to take us away into the learning exercise for the rest of our hour together. So, Emily, I hand it over to you, and I'll be running your slides for the next couple.
Awesome. Thanks, Beth. And welcome, everyone, to this great webinar where we're going to have David Behar speak about the wonderful work that he's been doing in the City and County of San Francisco. But a little background on the Projects and Evaluation Affinity Group. Our main purpose is to expand the knowledge of sort of adaptation projects that exist, evaluation methods that are currently taking place or being used to evaluate adaptation actions or adaptation projects across the United States and internationally, while also creating a network of people who are working within the space, whether they're interested in working in this space or already seasoned professionals in this area of evaluation for adaptation specifically. We have a couple of different goals. One is to provide relevant and informative webinars, of which one of them is today, and later on, perhaps, or after this slide, we'll go through the schedule of events that will be coming up over the next couple months. Second goal, if you could go back, sorry, Beth. Second goal is to share and generate engaging content based on information and discussions that we have during our phone meetings. And then eventually, based on these conversations that we have monthly and our regular webinars, we'll be compiling a resource library of existing evaluation methods and also use those discussions and informative dialogues to inform a published piece at the end of the year on effective evaluation methods taking place at the moment. Next slide. So a couple different outcomes. We're hoping that participants will learn something interesting and new in the webinars that we hold, that they'll leave the phone meetings with 2 or 3 main takeaways. We attempt to do that up front so that folks understand what the intention is of the phone calls and webinars. Also hope that participants are able to expand their knowledge around evaluation, how those evaluation processes work, and how monitoring and evaluating programs and projects over time can really create effective outcomes. A series of outputs that we have are, our webinars are all recorded. We do take notes of the discussions of our monthly calls, And as I mentioned before, we're going to be publishing a paper that summarizes the year's discussions and help to identify kind of where gaps exist in the evaluation field. We're also hoping to, as I mentioned before, have a curation of existing evaluation methods that will be posted to a kind of resource library. And then also just allow folks to understand and connect with the experts that exist in this space so that they can kind of, as they're going through their different adaptation projects, they can reach out to these experts and really understand kind of different indicators of evaluation that can be successfully integrated into project management and project evaluation. Next slide. Oh, and that's all for me. Thanks. Beth?
At the end of the slides, we will have the schedule for the rest of the year so folks can see what's coming up for the Projects and Evaluation Affinity Group. So just to tee up David's presentation quickly, I'm going to tell you about what the ASAP Prize for Progress is because David is going to speak to our winner. He was the recipient and recognized as the recipient for the City and County of San Francisco for the great work taking place there. The ASAP Prize for Progress is in its second term. It is a biannual award, and the purpose of the award is to improve professional practice in adapting to climate change and to curate and promote these promising practices. So we see the prize as having two purpose. One is to be highlighting those practices of leading communities, taking an opportunity to call out this success and really the incredible leadership that it requires to be advancing innovative adaptation techniques throughout this field, and then also to be then curating and promoting these promising practices. So not just highlighting and awarding work done well, but creating opportunities like this webinar, creating resources like the case studies that we're developing based on the Prize for Progress winners, and really giving an opportunity for these lessons to be heard and recognized and promoted so that we might see replication, so that we might see the field advancing, really embodying the lessons that can be taught through the great work that is taking place. So today's webinar speaker, David Behar, manages the climate adaptation policy for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. The Utility Commission delivers drinking water to 2.6 million Bay Area residents, generates hydroelectric power, and manages wastewater and stormwater facilities in San Francisco. David served as the founding chair of the Water Utility Climate Alliance, a coalition of 11 water utilities collaboratively advancing climate adaptation from 2007 to 2011. And in 2013 to 14, he chaired San Francisco's Sea Level Rise Commission, which created the city's first sea level rise policy, the subject of today's webinar. He's co-authored several recent articles exploring the boundaries of climate science and decision-making, and served on the steering committee for the 2017 National Adaptation Forum. David holds a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and we are so grateful to welcome him to give a presentation for all of us today. So David, with that, I think Emily will help to hand presentation control over to you.
Thank you, Beth. Great to be here. I really appreciate ASAP and ISC's putting this together to the recognition, of course, that we got for our work, and most importantly for the leadership that they are showing in this rapidly developing adaptation space. I just came off a Water Utility Climate Alliance call, and it's amazing the amount of action that's being generated these days in looking at what are best practices for adaptation, how do you use the science, how do you make decisions under uncertainty, et cetera. It's all kind of coming together in recent years, and it's going to continue to do so in future years. Can you guys see my slides okay? Am I in?
Yep, you're in. We can see them.
Good. So I'm, as Beth said, I'm going to give an overview of the work that the City and County of San Francisco did in developing our guidance for incorporating sea level rise into capital planning. This is the cover page of the document that was adopted in September of 2014. It's on the web. There's a long URL here. You can also just Google San Francisco SLR guidance, and it'll pop up there. It was 1 year in the making, and I'm going to go over the history of it, the elements that went into it, and a little bit about its implementation as well. The context where we were in 2013 was in a world of many different projections from many different sources. We all kind of started to know that we needed to think about how to adapt to sea level rise in the coastal community that is San Francisco, of course. But there are all kinds of different things, different tools that one could use, different projections one could rely on, and we needed to really get a handle on that so we're all on the same page. At the same time, a number of regulatory initiatives here in California from the San Francisco Bay Conservation Development Commission, the Coastal Commission, the State of California's Ocean Protection Council, and others were starting to be promulgated, and so the urgency and the need to do this was starting to get on everybody's radar screen at that time. And in 2013, Mayor Ed Lee said to a group of us that were thinking about this, okay, the first thing we want to do and that you're going to do is to draft guidance for incorporating sea level rise into our capital planning process. The reasoning being obvious: if we're investing considerable ratepayer dollars in our infrastructure in the city and county, we want to be sure that those investments are being made in a way that's cognizant of sea level rise and resilient as much as possible to that phenomenon. He also wanted us to get the coordination and collaboration among all the departments in the city organized and maintain the responsibility for that work within each department, but with an oversight function for the Capital Planning Committee, which considers and adopts our 10-year capital plan every 2 years, and the city engineer, who was sort of charged with reviewing the work that we did. So of course, the first thing we did was we put together a committee made up of the folks that you can see here on the left and the agencies that they represented within the city and county city government, and began meeting in September of 2013 and met for every couple of weeks for almost exactly a year before the guidance was adopted in September of 2014. We did a number of different things listed there. I'm just going to focus first on the first one we did, and the first thing you sort of have to do, which is, understand what it is you are adapting to as best as possible. And in that situation, we faced a reality that came out recently in a session at the National Adaptation Forum just this last May that Missy Stoltz, Laura Hansen, David Herren convened, where we developed a real-time word cloud. So the 45 people in the room during this session were asked the question, what words describe the current ecosystem of adaptation resilience services? And that could be interpreted a number of different ways, but it really was, okay, when you look at this and what you need to do, what do you come up with? And they asked, come up with one or two words, and obviously, confusion, fragmentation, dispersed, complexity, those are the things that come to people's minds in this community. And that's one of the challenges that we faced when we started this process. In particular, we were looking at three authoritative sources of information: the National Climate Assessment, the National Research Council, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, whose draft report was out at that point. And we saw two main problems. One is these three authoritative sources were all saying different to very different things about what the upper end of what's possible by the end of the century would be in terms of sea level rise. And secondly, the ranges were absolutely huge. It's not really actionable to say that sea level rise could be 8 inches and it could be 79 inches, or at least it didn't appear to be to us. And so that was a difficulty that we faced at the beginning. And as far as the National Research Council report goes, that was an interesting case study because that was a report that was asked for first by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, later joined by the governors of Washington and Oregon, and a number of federal agencies. But it started with Arnold, and Arnold was a pretty successful governor on climate issues, but not a technical person at all. And yet when the NRC report came out, confused, fragmented, complex are words that come to mind when reading that report. It was utterly unintelligible to most readers, which is an interesting commentary on what happens when you ask a science agency to give a decision-making body a report, and the science agency goes off and produces a very detailed, very technical science report, which they did. It was high quality, but it wasn't necessarily intelligible by lay people. And so if you'll bear with me with this kind of complicated slide here, we looked at, in depth, a couple of sources. We looked at many sources, but I'm zeroing in on the far left here, National Research Council report I just mentioned, second, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and then two regulatory manifestations, two guidances that were in from the Ocean Protection Council and the California Coastal Commission. And you know, this kind of mirrors the two challenges. On the one hand, we've got two very different upper end numbers, and on the other hand, we have some pretty wide ranges of what's estimated. And what we did then was a deep dive into the NRC report in particular, and what we found was something very powerful and very useful, which was sort of buried in the report in table 5.3 and in certain paragraphs here and there kind of spread throughout, a middle ground figure between the 17 and 66-inch range that that kind of was called projection in the report, and it basically was the most likely sea level rise number that the NRC committee thought was going to be true. And what we also learned at the same time, digging deep into IPCC, into the guidance, is that IPCC, as a matter of policy, doesn't actually do upper bound sea level rise numbers. Now, many of you may know that because that's become sort of a famous critique of IPCC, but at the time, we didn't really know it and weren't really sure and couldn't really figure out why this happened, why IPCC, the most prestigious body, said that sea level rise was going to peak at 39 inches in the year 2100, whereas NRC said 66. And at the same time, we learned that the regulatory bodies themselves did not actually include the most likely estimate from the NRC report, possibly because the NRC report was so unintelligible. And so you had this range of very low sea level rise and very high sea level rise reflected in the guidances, but not the in-between. So what we had was a decision that we made to adopt the National Research Council as best available science for our purposes and include that middle range number, that most likely figure that I mentioned. We had extracted through, I should mention, a lot of translation and climate service delivery on the part of scientists that we had relationships with and leaned on quite heavily, and who were extremely patient with all of our questions. And so at the end of the day, we ended up with a table like this, where we had the most likely and what we call the unlikely but possible numbers in the ranges. The most likely is, when we use these terms, they're not from the NRC report. We use these terms for our own purposes as they are defined in plain English. This is what's most likely. Doesn't mean it's what's going to happen. It means it's what's most likely. What at the upper end is unlikely to happen, which we thought was a fair characterization of the NRC report, but definitely possible. And so and by the way, we dumped the low end number as insufficiently precautionary, although it's just as unlikely but possible as the high end number. So there's the end of the science exercise for us in that respect, and it gave us some ranges that we thought we could work with. We didn't think they minimize the uncertainty, but we thought they helped us to establish a range that we thought we could work with. So a word on tools. At the same time, the PUC was developing inundation maps using the digital elevation model of the land surface from a 1 meter horizontal resolution LiDAR data set that was basically the state of the art at the time in terms of horizontal resolution, which is pretty important for this sort of thing. And then we overlaid on that sea levels over time to consider both sea level rise and storm surge. So I'm going to flood San Francisco here a little bit. There's 2 feet. There's 3 feet of sea level rise. Here's a foot of sea level rise in a 100-year storm surge, which is about 42 inches on average, additional elevation from a 1% storm. Add those up together, you get 52 inches of additional water elevation. Here's the upper bound of sea level rise of 5.5 feet from the NRC report. I'll pause here. This is 3 feet of sea level rise in a 100-year storm surge, but also, if you look up in the upper right, it also could be, let's see, 66 inches of sea level rise in a 1-year storm surge, which is really a king tide. It also could be 48 inches of sea level rise in a 25-year storm surge, or what I think should be called a 4% storm. That might not be right. Anyway, 25-year storm surge. So it doesn't require a predict then act level on sea level rise to think through all of these things. You can think about different levels of sea level and different kinds of storms when defining what this inundation would be. And then finally, here's the kind of worst case scenario. I don't say worst case scenario. I say worst case scenario because that's what the 66 inches really represented for us at the time, plus a 100-year storm surge, 108 inches, 9 feet of additional water elevation. Not a good thing, not a pretty picture for San Francisco. So these tools are extremely important and have been for us. And what we used with this last slide here, 108 inches, was we developed a sea level rise vulnerability zone map, which defines exactly that level of sea level rise and says to our managers, is part of the implementation of the guidance for incorporating sea level rise into capital planning, which I'm now getting into in a little bit more detail. If your project is shoreward from the blue line here, you have to comply with the guidance. You have to take the steps that are described in the guidance to evaluate the vulnerability of your project to sea level rise and a big storm. And the sea level rise vulnerability zone map was a GIS layer that everyone had available. The way that they would implement the guidance, and have done so in 2 different phases right now, 2 different cycles, is to, hold on, let me check my time, is to fill out the sea level rise checklist. This is version 2.0 because we made revisions after the first implementation cycle, which was in 2015, early 2015. Maybe 2014 might be actually the right date. But anyway, after going through one phase, you said, okay, here's some clarifications, here's some improvements we need to make in this checklist. And we don't have time to go over the checklist in any detail at all, except for one slide coming up in a second. But what it is a 6-page document that is sort of modeled on CEQA NEPA checklists, actually, so that project managers could input the specifics related to their project and evaluate the vulnerability to increased water elevations. This is a terrible graphic, but it shows the output from that process, 22 projects that fall within the sea level rise vulnerability zone. Sorry it's so hard to read, but the black dots are accompanied by description of each project. These were the 22 projects that were found to be inside the sea level rise vulnerability zone in the first implementation cycle, and these folks all filled out checklists. Interestingly, lots of projects that were outside the vulnerability zone filled out checklists too, and that's because we weren't incredibly clear about what you needed to do, which was a lesson that we learned in the first implementation project. Could have saved people a little bit more time. Sea level rise vulnerability zone, of course, will be a moving target as time goes on, as we get new information on sea level rise and what it looks like for the future. So the steps in the guidance as to adaptation are familiar. These were not things we invented. We took these from the literature. Step 1, review science. Step 2, assess vulnerability, assess risk, plan adaptation, implement, and monitor. The guidance addressed steps 1 through 4. I really only have time to go through steps 1 and 2. And what I want to do is highlight some key concepts in the guidance and the process that I ask people to go through to complete the checklist and think through the vulnerability, because these are, I think, some key concepts that we identified in the process that we needed to both define and explain. First is functional lifespan, referring to your infrastructure assets lifespan. and the second is the term adaptive capacity. So functional lifespan, we're still in the science review, believe it or not. Functional lifespan is one of the key elements that we're asking people to figure out there. And we felt like we needed to be very specific because there can be a very different understanding of what design life of an asset means, or an R&R cycle for an asset is, and the functional lifespan of that asset. Functional lifespan we defined in the checklist and in the guidance in a little more detail. I'm just citing here that this is page 2 of the checklist, is the period for which a structure can still meet the purposes for which it was constructed. It refers to the time an asset may realistically be in use at this location, including through one or more repair and maintenance cycles. So this is different than what engineers commonly call design life, where if you build a pump station and it's going to be where it is and in good shape and need only minor repairs over the 30-year period, and then it'll need major repairs after 30 years, that's the design life of that pump station. However, 30 years from now, you're not necessarily and probably are not going to just rip that pump station out and move it somewhere else. You've got a lot of infrastructure that's connected to that. So what you're going to do is rebuild it from the ground up, or rebuild it in some major way, and it will remain in place, and therefore it will remain subject to flooding from sea level rise, storm surge, and the like. And therefore, for another 30 years, that's another design life cycle that is included in the functional lifespan of that asset. Now you're up to 60 years. And in fact, on pump stations, we have recommended to our engineers that they think in all cases except those where there really is a credible idea that that location will be changed, through 3 design life cycles, so 90 years. So we're asking people to fill in the remaining or potential functional lifespan in years as 90 years for many of the pump stations. And do the math, and you'll see that for that kind of facility and for many other facilities that we're building in the wastewater enterprise in particular, we're into and beyond the beginning of the 22nd century in terms of where these things are going to be. And that's where we've gotten more and more traction over time in thinking about beyond 2100, which is way beyond people's terms of office, in terms of our decision makers, way beyond people's careers, but not necessarily beyond where the life cycle of the assets are going to be at, and therefore the planning framework when we're building things. The second concept in the vulnerability assessment, besides exposure, which means do you get wet, and sensitivity means does it matter if you get wet, and these are all defined in the guidance, is adaptive capacity. And that's a term that we found a meaning for in the literature that we found to be insufficient. So we added more meaning. I don't think we did that originally, but we really did add meaning in terms of the term for our own purpose. So this is back to the sea level rise ranges that we came up with after the science review process. There's still a tremendous amount of uncertainty. There's a big difference between 11 and 24 inches, or between 36 and 66 inches in depending on which time frame you're talking about. And so uncertainty doesn't go away. And the question, and the cost of adapting to 3 feet versus 5.5 feet can be substantially different as well. And so how do you make that decision of whether should you adapt to the most likely sea level rise numbers? Should you adapt to unlikely sea level rise numbers? And at all times, we're always thinking that the point at which we are implementing adaptation, we're figuring 2 things. 1, it's going to be expensive, and 2, we're going to have to go to our ratepayers or our taxpayers, if we're not an enterprise department, and tell them we're raising their rates or raising their taxes, or possibly putting in infrastructure financing mechanisms in particular areas of the city. And we're going to have to explain to them why we're raising their rates by that amount. And so we have to have good arguments about why we picked one scenario or another. So what does adaptive capacity mean in the guidance? It means 2 things. Concept 1, implemented adaptation protection. So resiliency, resilience features can be relatively easily enhanced in the future. So the easiest example is a levee. If you build the levee to protect, to say, 3 feet of sea level rise by the year 2100, and you leave enough of a footprint at the base of the levee to add to its height relatively easily, meaning you don't have to tear down the initial resilience feature, i.e. the levee, in order to achieve increased resilience, because you now realize that most likely is not coming true, unlikely but possible is coming true. By leaving enough of a footprint, you can modularize your adaptation response to that shoreline vulnerability. Another one is electrical equipment can relatively be easily moved off of the ground floor. So you've got equipment that is not even in the inundation zone at 3 feet, but at 5.5 feet, it is inundated. At the point you reach another design life cycle beginning, you can move that electrical equipment off the floor relatively easily. You don't have to tear down the entire pump station or move the entire pump station. So what this really is about is avoiding stranded assets, avoiding an initial investment, assuming a significant one that has to be abandoned in effect to achieve resilience to a worst case scenario should that prove to be coming true. Either worst case scenario anticipated in your guidance or a worst case scenario that wasn't even anticipated because all of a sudden, Antarctica is falling into the Southern Ocean. The second concept for adaptive capacity is basically redundancy. So you might have an exposed asset that's sensitive, but it might not matter because there's an acceptable alternate route, and the damage is not necessarily, there's an acceptable alternative and the damage isn't necessarily significant. So a road is a good example. If you've got a road that is going to be exposed, it'll be underwater. It's going to be sensitive. You can't use it if it's underwater, but it's redundant. Then that particular transportation use value has redundancy, and so the adaptive capacity of that asset is high. Another example is multiple assets that provide the same basic service. If one of them goes out, you still have others that are going to respond. Now, if one of them goes out and is damaged, that's a different situation than, say, a road, which wouldn't necessarily be damaged. But the point is you have redundancy, and so your adaptation response can be somewhat different as a result. What does lack of adaptive capacity look like? Basically, the way I always explain it is one bite at the adaptation apple, meaning you adapt once at the location, and subsequent adaptations require abandonment of that resilience asset and basically starting from ground zero. There aren't necessarily a ton of great examples that I've ever thought of that, but one I thought of is if you have a treatment plant and you build a tunnel through a mountain for the discharge for that treatment plant into the ocean, you can't adapt that tunnel to be resilient to higher levels of sea level than you anticipate. You'd basically be boring another hole in the mountain. And so that's sort of an example of you'd be spending twice as much to adapt in a modular fashion as you would if you didn't have the resilience or it didn't have the adaptive capacity in the initial asset. And in that situation, what we have told managers to think about is planning for the unlikely but possible higher end. If you get that only one bite at the adaptation apple, then you should be thinking about how to create resilience that's going to last through a longer period of time and under circumstances in which sea level rise is worse or worse than what is most likely to occur. You are less likely to have stranded assets in that situation. You still might overspend because it might be that treatment plant becomes obsolete before sea level reaches, say, 5.5 feet, because the unlikely but possible sea level rise numbers in the past have been things that might come true in 2200 or 2300 or 2400, and that's still true even with the higher numbers that we have today. And so there's not no risk associated with that, but you limit your risk to a degree. The exercise in completing the checklist has been one that's gone on an asset by asset basis, and I'm gonna say that one of the advantages of that is that it has created or is helping to create a culture within city and county government that we need to think both on these kinds of temporal scales, which are not the usual form of thinking in a planning environment, or even an infrastructure environment to an extent, and also that it is resulting in extensive evaluation of the vulnerability of our city and county assets, in this case, in those in the 10-year capital plan. We have to think about shoreline-wide protections at the same time, broader protections that don't just protect either city and county assets or city and county assets that are in our 10-year capital plan, but private sector assets that are, co-located with our assets, with our city assets, and, those things we haven't built yet, like development projects. And so I don't think we're arguing, I know we're not arguing that the guidance on capital planning is the be-all, end-all of adaptation response. It's not. We need to be thinking more broadly. But what it's done is gotten us rolling in these areas in a lot of ways that are, I think, accruing benefits across the bureaucracy in thinking through these issues and being prepared to think about them in a more broad sense. Having said that, there are assets, and I'm going to highlight two to conclude here, that have taken the process developed in the guidance and the 10-year capital plan requirement that you must think about sea level rise and complete a checklist to be included in the budget. I didn't mention that, but that is the requirement imposed by the Capital Planning Committee, which is a committee made up of all the department heads in the city and county government. And those assets that are, that are in design right now need to be worked on to make them functional, are also having to think through resilience in conjunction with the capital planning. So this is a fireboat station right on the water. You can see the location in the upper right there. Obviously, that's subject to water elevation changes. And they adopted a barge floating structure for, this is not a great diagram, but it shows how this barge is, this platform, the fireboat station pier is going to be floating, which will give it a tremendous resilience to different levels of sea level rise, and was what was included in the design documents and the approval process that adopted that design was the idea that we don't know where sea level rise is going to go in the future, and so this floating pier design gives us the most resilience for our dollar and the longest lasting resilience under even some of the worser case scenarios. And so that's a project that went through this process and adopted some change. This is a public safety building, Traffic Company Forensic Services Division, so San Francisco Police Department managed, that you can see it's close to what's called Islas Creek, which is one of the most infrastructure-rich areas in the city. That is also one of those areas that turned blue in the inundation maps that I mentioned, or that I showed. And this design is kind of hard to see, but if you look here, this represents about 9 feet of additional elevation for this new building. Obviously, you can see this is in design. And that gives it resilience to a worst case scenario in the year 2100 for sea level rise plus a 100-year storm. They're building this new right here. Obviously, they're thinking through life cycle through the end of the century. And because they're building from the ground up, and because the adaptive capacity of a building is fairly low, you can't rebuild, or you can't raise the building up, not a building like this anyway, if sea level rise ends up at the higher end. Then they decided, at least preliminarily, this is not final design, that they'd build to a worst case scenario to ensure that they achieve resilience. And obviously the incremental cost of that was not significant, or not crushing anyway. So in general, we're moving forward with infrastructure planning for city and county using these kind of resilience features and this analysis process on a biannual capital planning committee cycle, while at the same time addressing shoreline-wide protections that will focus on, say, this entire Islas Creek area that you see here, not just this one building, but all of the infrastructure that's around here, public and private, and of course, public safety. That concludes the presentation that I have, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that presentation. And I just want to say, from the ASAP perspective, when we learned about this project and received the application for the Prize for Progress from San Francisco, what caught our eye the most was the guidance being so straightforward, this checklist that somebody could easily relate to, the way that it did look like other checklists that managers were using, and then the fact that there are these implemented projects, that fireboat pier example, and this work that's happening with the forensic station, so that for somebody who is listening to your presentation today and thinking about not only how do I do it, but what could it look like when it's finished? I think that the work taking place in San Francisco is a fairly rare and for that reason innovative example of what does this kind of adaptation planning and strategy look like when it's taken through to implementation. So I really appreciate you taking the time to present, and we have a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to go ahead and just start from the top of these and get us through some of the questions while we have time together. So Lisa Graken asks, she's just curious on how did you distribute the checklist and how do you encourage people to use it? And I think you touched on that very briefly towards the end, but if you could maybe just reiterate where this fits into the capital improvement process, that'd be great.
Sure. So Capital Planning Committee actually adopted the guidance and they manage the capital planning submissions, meaning if you want to spend money on something, whether it's new capital or old capital you're renewing, it goes through the CPC before it goes to the Board of Supervisors for passage in the budget. And the requirement CPC adopted was you must complete a checklist for that project to go to the Board of Supervisors and be adopted. And, you know, honestly, the first time we went through it, we weren't particularly detail-oriented necessarily, that every I got dotted and every T was crossed. There was actually less time than we wanted because it took a little longer to get the thing adopted. But also, you know, we need to not let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. What we did was we trained people. So if you end up going to the website, you will see a number of different tools, the guidance, the checklist, instructions for staff, the sea level rise vulnerability map. Now there's a design standards memo that we added this time that adds clarification to shoreline elevations and the meaning of mean higher high water and all of that. We then offered a training, and in the first training that we did in 2014, January 2015, I believe it was, 80 engineers and planners showed up. And we went through the checklist step by step and how to do it. The second one we did another training. I think there were 40 or 50 engineers and planners that showed up. And these are the people who are going to do the checklist and do the improved checklist because we added a lot more features to the second checklist. So that's basically how we got people to do it.
Great, thank you. So a question just, I think, about how this holistically is fitting into other planning processes in the city. Did a zoning reform, this is from Emily Corman, did a zoning reform occur in conjunction with the sea level rise projections, and was that part of the coordination process that's been taking place?
No, we haven't done any ordinances. We have some flood control ordinance that mostly have to do with building materials. We have a requirement that new development, when it, you know, builds stormwater related facilities to support that development, they have to be able to be handed over to the PUC, to us at the end of the process, at the end of the project, because we manage them. So those are design standards for that. But no, none of that has changed yet. Those are still things that are being looked at in a more comprehensive approach that we're in the middle of designing as a city right now.
Mm-hmm. And then John Bulldyke had a couple questions for you. One, how is San Francisco thinking about saltwater contamination either in this or perhaps outside of this process?
Well, saltwater is a bad thing for electrical components, obviously, and that's one of the places where people need to think through what the vulnerability is. If he's referring to, you know, components of infrastructure, that's important. We have one thing that's pending right now is looking at groundwater impacts of sea level rise. So the additional head that comes from rising seas, bringing the water table higher and possibly reaching our stormwater wastewater pipes, which many of which are quite old, none of which are pressurized, and therefore all of which potentially are subject to infiltration by saltwater. Saltwater in the system is a bad thing. It compromises the biological organisms that treat our wastewater and stormwater. so that's a place where salt water is bad. We've got reverse flow into our 29 bayside combined system overflow points as a result of sea level rise. It's going from a nuisance to a problem over time, and we've actually budgeted $20 to $40 million to create resilience to those features. For those features, we need to continue to have the overflow capabilities during big storms in the wintertime, but we don't want bay water in our system because, again, it compromises the treatment process and does other things that are undesirable. So saltwater vulnerability is one of the key aspects of what we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm. And this is questions from Sasha Peterson. He's asking, where between the likely and the upper end do you see project managers choosing to focus, and does that choice depend on the type of project, and do they have the option to choose between, if they're going to be considering the likely or the upper end projections that are being provided in the guidance?
So the way you determine the water level vulnerability is through the functional lifespan of the project. So you through the worksheet, through the checklist, there's not worksheets, but there's actually a lot of math built into the checklist. So you plug in the elevation of your facility, you plug in the functional lifespan of your project, you get the end date for the project, so 2085. In 2085, most likely sea level rise will be some number lower than 36 inches, and unlikely but possible sea level rise will be some number lower than 66 inches. And then we ask you to talk about the adaptive capacity of the asset. To what extent can you modularize your sea level rise, your resilience features, or not? In a lot of cases, they are rebuildable, and so we don't require. And I should say that at the end of the checklist process, you don't have an adaptation plan for that asset. You have a vulnerability understanding related to that asset. And adaptation, if you're in a phase where you need to adapt, like the fireboat pier, like the safety building, like parts of our Southeast treatment plant I didn't get to talk about, then you're being asked to create resilience to the extent that makes sense given the adaptive capacity approach that we've given people. So really, it's a little bit toggle between most likely and unlikely but possible, because everything in between is pure speculation, and that's sort of one of the challenges of uncertainty in climate change planning in general, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this is a question from Josh Foster, and I think it kind of builds on what you were talking about there. He asks, is San Francisco collecting and cataloging the thinking processes from managers via the checklist or based on input from the checklist as sort of rolling lessons learned and as a way to collect innovation as managers brainstorm? And I think really getting to what you were saying, David, that this is a tool that's a vulnerability assessment, but I'm curious, as is Josh, is San Francisco cataloging now how managers are going the next step to then think about implementing adaptation practices in their infrastructure? Because I feel like this is essentially it's like a gold mine of case studies that we could be tracking and sharing, and is at an individual project case.
Yeah, cataloging doesn't come up very much in our day-to-day work. We're just trying to keep our heads above water, and in the case of all these checklists, it's get them done correctly, get them done on time, and making sure folks understand them. I mean, what we've done is we've changed the guidance one time already after a first implementation, mostly to be more clear and also to drop the low end. I didn't show you the sea level rise projections that we used from the NRC report, but there were basically 5 numbers for every year, and we thought that was not helpful in the end, and in fact was not used by anybody. Nobody was using low end, likely -1 sigma, likely +1 sigma, and high end, which is what was in the NRC report. So we simplified the table, we added more explanation, we changed the checklist in some very fundamental ways, all of this based on input from managers. And we're about to change the checklist again in a bunch of ways, all based on the input from the experience of implementing the second checklist. A lot of it is mechanical, fillable PDF. It's kind of a complicated thing to create, but as far as cataloging the experience, that's a great idea, and maybe Josh will want to collaborate in helping us to put that together.
Yeah, absolutely. I could see that really building out a great library of implemented projects. That would be an awesome resource for an organization like ASAP actually to be maintaining to share.
I will say we have talked over time to a number of other folks, New York and Florida in particular, about the checklist and how we've used it and what it is. So we're benchmarking and we're collaborating across boundaries whenever asked, and that's happened to an extent.
That's great. I was actually going to, I was going to ask a question about your kind of peers and who you were learning from and who you've seen coming to you for those kinds of lessons. And I think about Southeast Florida, which I think has not gone as deep as what you've done really with this kind of development of a toolkit and the guidance, but they certainly went through those 4 counties of Southeast Florida and forming their compact, similar challenges of getting the sea level rise information consistent across a geography.
We've talked to those folks and found that their collaboration across county lines is something we can learn from. In the Bay Area, believe it or not, there's very little of that that's going on, and we all recognize it as a problem. It's I don't know the numbers, it's like 81 cities and 104 jurisdictions that have control of lands that are subject to inundation under sea level rise in the future, and there's really no one controlling authority, nor will there ever be. But can we learn from one another, collaborate in developing all of this, and then ensure that when each of us take on shoreline resilience, we're doing it in a way that's cognizant on the adjacent and nearby effects on others. Because if you armor a shoreline, you're going to change the bathtub and how it overflows for virtually all other shorelines. And it's not always a significant amount of water, but it can be an important amount of water. And so we need to do that better. And we've learned a lot from the Southeast Florida and other in the Tampa Bay area as well about collaborating across institutional boundaries, which is extremely important.
Yep. Yeah, and I think we see that as both an adaptation. You think about adaptation and mitigation nexus, single metropolitan areas. Cities and jurisdictions alone really only control so much of their fate. It takes that regional perspective if we're going to be thinking about long-term resilience and long-term changes both in the way that we adapt and the way that we mitigate and think about climate and its impact on everything as we live, work, and play in our communities. David, I want to thank you so much again for joining us, for sharing this project and sharing the implemented projects and the process. I will let everyone know this webinar will be up on the site, and I hope that folks who are part of ASAP will seek out David. He is a member of ASAP and his profile is available there, and folks who have not yet joined us will take this as an opportunity to follow up and to learn more about the great work that's happening across the ASAP network. I'm going to hand it back.